you so much, Natalia, for making this possible. Thank you, everybody, for coming. The three of us usually meet and speak Polish and Ukrainian in Lviv, but today will be different and special.
Neither of us focuses specifically on Jewish history. Yet in our intellectual journeys, we have engaged with Jewish history, heritage, and culture, which has helped us embrace the complexity of Ukraine, the place we study and live.
Our presentation today has two parts, and they seem very different. Mehil will share some of her research on theater, research about the past, research intended for a scholarly book.
Sophia will then share some of the projects in public history undertaken by the Center for Urban History in cooperation with other institutions in Lviv, projects that bring Jewish experiences into the contemporary city, projects realized in public space and intended for a broad public.
Taken together, these two presentations address similar questions.
How do we see the Jewish experience connected to place?
How do we work with multi-ethnicity in diversity, academically, but also publicly?
How do we analyze and present Ukraine as a multi-ethnic space? Specifically, how do we comprehend Ukraine as a place shaped by the experiences of all the peoples living there?
Finally, and mostly, how can we tell the story of this coexistence honestly, openly, and authentically in academic and public spheres? Now,
thank you.
Okay. We'll continue with the first part. Elena will keep it.
So I'll begin with the title, which is my inspiration for this talk and actually eventually book chapter. In the 8-minute film clip from the Kiev trials in 1946, which one can find online thanks to the Foundation and Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center in Kyiv, survivor Dina Pronicheva explains at one moment that she decided to be silent when a German stepped on her arm and on her chest to make sure she was truly dead, lying at the bottom of the ravine. This struck me. Of course, medical studies show the body's ability to survive moments of acute stress. Still, her ability to feign death, in Karl Berghoff's words, demands some consideration. As a theater scholar, I immediately thought of the obvious. Pronicheva was an actress. She was a trained theater professional who had worked in Kiev theater for over a decade, performing in the puppet theater, which of course required mastery over her body. So my talk expands on this moment to suggest the ways in which analyzing Dina Pronicheva's life, not only as a survivor of Babyn Yar, but also as a professional theater woman, opens up new questions about how we come to know the experience of war, and how placing her in Ukrainian studies actually helps us know Ukraine better. Pronicheva is well known as one of the few survivors of Babyn Yar. Her testimony has served scholars and courts for describing Nazi crimes in Ukraine, and often written in a phrase after her name is her profession, described as something along the lines of Soviet Jewish actress at the Kiev Puppet Theater. That's from Wikipedia. The phrase suggests that theater is merely a quirky side note to the important biographical information, Holocaust survivor and witness. In fact, however, theater played a major role in Pronicheva's life before the war, during the war, and after the war. Dina Pronicheva was an experienced puppeteer, and she was also a Jewish actress, although never an actress in the Yiddish theater. She was a Russian and Ukrainian-speaking actress at Kiev's Puppet Theater, which performed largely in Ukrainian. Moreover, after her survival at Babyn Yar, she spent over 2 years passing as a non-Jew in Ukrainian theater under Nazi occupation. So let me tell Dina Pronicheva's survival story of Babyn Yar through the lens of theater. And here I move from this video clip to the written 20-page stenogram of her testimony given later in April 1946 to the Commission on the History of the Great Patriotic War, which shows how Babyn Yar was only the beginning of her survival story. She remained alive for 2 years, from October 1941 until December 1943, when the Kiev region was liberated. As her testimony shows, theater helped her survive these 2 years, or rather, her survival was intertwined with theater, dependent on her network of connections from her career and her skills acquired as an actress. And looking at this theatrical experience itself highlights aspects of her story different from those that have been investigated in the extensive scholarship on the atrocity of Babyn Yar itself. So at a certain point, and there's a long amount of information that one could talk about her experience in Kiev right after her survival of Babyn Yar, but I'm going to skip forward just a little bit. So at a certain point, after a story of precarity surviving in the city of Kiev, she walks about 85 kilometers south to Bila Tsirkva in tattered sandals, and eventually ends up working at the Myski Teatr imeni Shevchenko, a local theater touring from Kiev, where she had an old friend working, Nikolai Tsigankov. The State Archive of Kiev Region card catalog has a card for a Nikolai Tsigankov who worked at the Shevchenko Theater under occupation. And this is part of the research of this paper, which is tracking the names mentioned in her testimony through the now digitized archives from this particular archive. And you can connect the names of these people with where they were actually working under occupation. And so this particular theater faced censorship troubles in Kiev, and it split into multiple groups run by individual actors like Tsigankov, who were then touring throughout the region. But such connections from before the war could also bring danger to her ability to pass. Another Kiev actress arrives at the same theater, recognizes her, and gives her up as Jewish. But Pronicheva was saved from this denunciation by a technical worker, Grigory Afanasyev, whose Jewish wife and baby had recently been shot. So he states that anyone accusing Pronicheva will have to deal with him, imet dela. Somehow this threat works, and Pronicheva works at this theater for the rest of the German occupation as an actress, administrator, or ticket taker. She says whatever it takes to remain employed in this space of, however tenuous and potentially dangerous, safety. She makes use of her acting skills not only on the stage, but also off stage. In one segment of her testimony, she describes witnessing the Holocaust. She's not only a survivor, but a witness who resisted. In summer 1943, the theater tours to Ruzhin, where there was a Jewish ghetto remaining with 38 Jews. And they worked in a tailoring factory. And so in order to help them, Pronicheva tears her skirt on purpose and demands that the Jews fix her skirt before the evening's performance. And this gives her the opportunity to connect with the Jewish community for whom she's managed to purchase some food hidden by her skirt in the basket. And her friend Afanasyev helps her with this ruse by distracting the local guards, chatting with them, and promising free theater tickets for the evening's performance, so that Pronicheva is able to sneak this basket of goods into the ghetto. Clearly, this successful gambit required acting skill. Yet the story does not end happily, of course. She concludes this episode by saying that the district commissioner showed up and ordered the ghetto liquidated. She and the other members of the theater company watched the Jews rounded up, taken away, and shot. As she says, they took them all before our eyes and shot them right away, which we all saw. And here Pronicheva blurs the lines in Holocaust scholarship, because she was a Babyn Yar survivor, but also a Jewish woman passing as a non-Jew engaged in an act of resistance. And performing this role of a non-Jewish actress required incredible talent. At one point, Pronicheva was forced to be a conferencier in German, which demanded introducing various acts, making jokes, connecting with the audience for an evening of variety show entertainment clearly intended specifically for the Germans. Variety entertainment was a part of life under occupation, and so Dina Pronicheva, a Jewish survivor of Babyn Yar, was an MC in German for the Nazis. She didn't want to do this for fear of being found out. Her German wasn't very good. But the managing director of the theater, Vasil Prekhnenko, knew she was Jewish and threatened to denounce her if she didn't do it. And somehow she pulls off this feat. And she worked at this theater until the end of 1943, when Kiev was liberated and she could return to the city, where she immediately rejoined the puppet theater. So this narrative of theater and survival shifts three interconnected historiographies: Ukrainian theater history, Jewish history, and the embodied nature of theater as a way of thinking about the experience of war. So scholars of Ukrainian theater, such as Svetlana Maximenko and Maya Harbuzyuk, point to the ways in which average artists were able to preserve Ukrainian culture even in the most extreme conditions during the war. This is a difference with the war today. In the Second World War, Ukrainian theater troops were allowed to perform in Ukrainian. And the repertoire performed was generally 19th century classic Ukrainian melodramas with a lot of song and dance by such authors as Ivan Korpay-Koukari, Michael Kropivnitsky, and Taras Shevchenko. These plays told of rural life, and tragic love affairs with song and dance, and would have been known among the local population. Theaters were allowed to perform in Ukrainian, and so indeed these artists were working to preserve this aspect of their cultural heritage. However, bringing the Jewish experience to Ukrainian theater history deepens an understanding of theatrical life under German occupation. Famously, Ukrainian actor and director Josip Hyrniak directed the first ever Ukrainian language performance of Shakespeare's Hamlet at the Lviv Opera Theater under German occupation in 1943. It was translated by Mikhailo Rudnitsky, who was an intellectual from a mixed Jewish-Ukrainian family. Hyrniak was a survivor of the Soviet Gulag, who during the war was able to escape the Soviets, make his way to Lviv under occupation, where he actually found theatrical success. From there, he and his wife Olympia made it to the DP camps and finally to the United States. Hyrniak wrote later in Emigration, "The Second World War became my life raft." Yet the show, the first Ukrainian Hamlet, took place a stone's throw away from the Yanovska camp, where the city's Jews, and not only, were systematically murdered during the war. So this highlight of Ukrainian theater history, a life raft for Hyrniak, occurred a short walk from the destruction of an entire community. So these two war experiences seem in utterly different worlds. But actually they come together when we include the history of the Holocaust into Ukrainian theater history. Dina Pronicheva, it seems, was not the only Jewish artist to survive through theater. Several worked at the Kleinkunsttheater in Kiev as musicians and dancers. There was a violinist, apparently, who played with the Kiev Opera. And finally, a Semyon Gruzberg, who was attached to the Lviv Opera Theater, made sketches of Josip Hyrniak's Hamlet and other shows, actually, and survived the war on their payroll as Gruzbenko, of course. And actually, on this program of Hamlet, you can't really see on the slide, but he signed Gruzbenko right down in the bottom left corner. And through Gruzbenko Gruzberg, we actually bridge the Lviv Opera Theater and the Ukrainian Hamlet and the Yanovska camp, right, and the experience of Jews during the war. And actually, art and violence had never been separate in these regions. Troops touring outside Kiev in the Civil War period witnessed the consequences of anti-Jewish violence shaking the area. Famously, theater director Les Kurbas in 1920 notes repertory choices to resonate with the local Jewish population traumatized by pogroms, actually precisely in Bila Tsirkva in 1920. Yet it is also important to remember that while the presence of Pronicheva or other Jewish artists in these theaters under Nazi occupation is shocking to us now, theaters in the Soviet period actually were multi-ethnic. It would not have been perceived as strange before the war that there were artists who were Jewish and Ukrainian and Russian as defined on their passports, all working together, say, in the puppet theater. But ethnicity became a weapon for use in a time of war. And the point is that these stories of Jewish artists in Ukrainian theaters in the war reveals the diversity of experiences making theater during the war and the intertwining of this diversity. And this diversity characterized the post-war puppet theater as well, which Pronicheva rejoined in 1944. So Maria Tobilevich-Kresan was the adopted daughter of a very famous Ukrainian playwright, Ivan Karpenko-Kari and Sofia Tobilevich. She was tried during the famous SVU trial in 1929. She only came back to Kiev in 1941. And under the Nazis, she was able to found a sewing school for girls. And under its auspices, she started many artistic workshops and studios for children, including a puppet theater. And she hired people to help with each studio, which helped them survive, of course. And when the Soviets liberated Kiev, they somehow, and I'm unclear on why and how, they let Tobilevich run the newly reconstituted state puppet theater. And joining that troupe was Raisa Margolina, who had been one of the major designers and puppet makers from before the war, who spent the war in evacuation in Central Asia. So at this theater in Kiev, in 1944, before the war's over, was a survivor of Baban Yar who performed for Germans, Pronicheva, a Ukrainian theatrical legacy who survived occupation in Kiev, Tobilevich-Kresan, and a Jewish artist who'd survived an evacuation, Margolina, and they're all working together at this theater. From 1945, the theater performed in the Karayet synagogue, and later they would perform in the Brodsky synagogue, both formerly Jewish spaces, of course. And this place of post-war Ukrainian theater was, as we see, often performing in formerly Jewish spaces. So Dina Pronicheva's story demands that we consider the placeness of culture in Ukraine, the ways Ukrainian theater might unfold in Jewish spaces, lost to their community because of violence. And I think this interconnectedness really characterizes theater in Ukraine. Yet just as examining Pronicheva's survival highlights different aspects of Ukrainian theater history, focusing on Jewish theater itself through Pronicheva's story highlights a different trajectory in the analysis of Jewish theater, especially in Ukraine. The Soviet state, as you may know, murdered Solomon Mikhoels in 1948, and Yiddish theaters throughout the Soviet Union closed shortly thereafter. The State Yiddish Theater of Soviet Ukraine, working then in Chernivtsi, closed in 1950. And most scholars consider this the end of Yiddish theater in the Soviet Union, and in a literal sense, of course, it was. But when we draw Dina Pronicheva into this story, we might change our terms and our categories, because Jews continued working in theaters throughout Soviet Ukraine after the war and after the closure of Yiddish theaters. And in fact, I would argue that one of the features shaping post-war Ukrainian theater, although it escapes surfacing in archival documentation, is the way the trauma of the war and the survival of violence must have shaped post-war theater companies. So let's look at Pronicheva through Ukrainian theater history. So she was born in 1911, so she would have been in theater school, say, around 1931. The Puppet Theater in Kyiv was founded in 1927 under the auspices of the Theater of Young Spectators by Oleksandr Solomarsky and Irina Dayeva, who's a well-known director who counted among her achievements creating a training program for actors in the Polish theater studio, actually, the only one in the Soviet Union. In 1931, Zinaida Picholovich took over. She was the only woman to study directing with Ukrainian theater innovator Les Kurbas. And the theater actually had a Yiddish division, in fact, that won second place in an all-union competition in 1937. These are artists, Picholovich, Dayeva, Solomarsky, that Pronicheva would have seen and with whom she would have studied. I could go on, but simply to say she was a puppet theater actress contains an entire world of people and institutions and achievements that are well known by scholars of Ukrainian theater. Scholars of Jewish history do not include her work with Ukrainian theater in their analysis because theater seems outside Babyn Yar. And it is, of course. And yet to understand Pronicheva requires investigating not only atrocity, but also the arts. She was, in fact, deeply a part of a network of Soviet Ukrainian theater very particular to this place. And moreover, what the existence of that network suggests is that Jewishness in Soviet Ukrainian theater did not end after Mikhoels. Yiddish theater might have ended, but not Jews in theater. And in fact, tracing a network of connections between Jewish artists, non-Jewish artists, and various institutions shows that perhaps one of Soviet Ukraine's specificities is the density of connections between them. So beyond Pronicheva, let me mention several Jewish artists who worked in post-war Soviet Ukrainian theater. So first we could mention Anna Schoenfeld, who acted in the State Yiddish Theater until its demise in 1950. She was a very big actress. She actually acted with Alexander Granach when he was in Kyiv. She played Jessica to his Shylock in Merchant of Venice. Then she was transferred to Lviv after the closure of the Yiddish theater to the Musical Comedy Theater, which was run by Isaac Grinspun, also Jewish. Yet in 1953, this company was transferred to Odessa in exchange for the theater of the Odessa military district moving to Lviv and becoming the theater of the Carpathian military district. Schoenfeld did not move to Odessa. She stayed in Lviv, and she got a job at the Lviv Puppet Theater. Like Pronicheva, she also worked with puppets after the war. Schoenfeld worked at the Musical Comedy Theater with Zina Diktaryova, who would later be a star at the theater of the Carpathian military district. So we see this connection between the State Yiddish Theater, its actors, and three theaters in Lviv: the Musical Comedy, the Puppet, and the military district. Or we could take Leah Buchova, who was a star of the State Yiddish Theater in Odessa, but joined the theater of the Kiev military district when it was performing on the Stalingrad front during the war. The company was sent to Odessa in 1944, where it took up residence in the building formerly occupied by Buchova's former home, the State Yiddish Theater of Odessa. Yet Buchova transferred to the Russian language non-military stage in 1945, complaining of not enough good roles for women in Yiddish theater. Or finally, take Sidi Tal, who also performed Yiddish song and dance numbers in Evacuation, and managed to keep performing even, sometimes in Yiddish, in the Chernivtsi Philharmonic into the 1970s. So because of the murder of audiences and artists during the Holocaust, focus on this network of artists and institutions has been really limited. There was a lot of archival collecting that happened for Ukrainian language theater, for example, but it never happened for Yiddish theater or Jews in theater. And so this dense web connecting artists is really not visible today, apart from painstaking archival research and just celebrating when a name happens to show up in a cast list or a memorandum. But tracing these connections shows that while Yiddish theater may have largely ended, the Jewish artists, directors, and designers who survived the war often had very long careers in Soviet Ukraine, bringing their experiences to new theatrical institutions. Finally, placing Pronicheva as a woman at the center of analysis highlights her body. Beyond the physical experience of Babyn Yar, her story, when considered through the lens of gender, highlights the ways a woman experienced the war. When reading her full testimony, paying attention to physical details, a layer of experience emerges. So for example, when she's staying with a costumer acquaintance when she first arrives in Bila Tserkva, she notes that she's worried and nervous because it's clear she has no blouse on under her jacket. She was not wearing enough clothes. And this detail, on the one hand, alerts us to her experience of survival in Kiev, right? What happened to her clothes? And second, it reminds us that staying with people involved bodily intimacy and nakedness. And the costumer actually gives her a blouse. Performance studies scholar Diana Taylor's work on Latin American theater helps clarify the importance of the body that might not show up in archives. She shows how local knowledge is preserved through folk festivals and rituals. Bodies, she argues, carry as much knowledge as archival documents. And she asks, how does performance transmit knowledge about the past in ways that allow us to understand it and to use it? This epistemology of the body is also in the work of trauma scholar Kathy Caruth, who writes that Kadzetnik's famous fall when he fainted while giving testimony in the Ackman trial was a moment of his body actually conveying knowledge. She writes, the act of transmission is thus a means of passing on, through the drama of human testimony, the impact of an unimaginable history. And I'll just add that actually there's a memoir about Pronicheva presenting at these 1946 Kiev trials that says that actually when she left the platform, two people were there and she actually sort of fainted and dropped to her knees. So in fact, she too had a bodily experience that conveys knowledge about what she's been through. So how do we imagine, as historians, what the body might pass on when analyzing the past? Pronicheva's written testimony becomes Diana Taylor's archive, that is, we can read the document. But the deeper bodily experience becomes the repertoire, the embodied knowledge from her traumatic experience that we can now only imagine from the words in the text. So how might we read that epistemology of the body into the past using our archive documents and our imagination? Inspired by Taylor, let us consider the way Pronicheva's story inscribes itself on her body. The arm that was stepped on by the German boot, the feet that made it to Bila Tserkva in tattered sandals, the body that was full of scars, the eyes and ears that witnessed the murder of the Ruzhin Jews, her mind and her mouth learning, remembering, pronouncing German words as a conferencier, the nakedness she describes feeling even after liberation. The testimony, in fact, has a deeply physical aspect in her choice of words and details. Finally, her testimony notes that at the end of the war, she is linked up with stage worker Grigory Afanasyev. After liberation, he, like many, joined the Red Army and went to fight in the war. He returned an invalid. This fact of the connection between Pronicheva and Afanasyev adds another embodied dimension to her story. Her life changed in horrible and traumatic ways, and she also met her second husband. But let us return to puppets. How are puppets a part of this story? The puppet is a paradoxical object. It is an object. It is not alive. Yet it can so easily convince an audience of life, and it depends on the physical engagement of the invisible actors who manipulate them. What did it mean for Pronicheva to return to her puppets? I wonder if the puppets protected the artists. The body was not directly vulnerable to the audience's eyes, ears, and judgment. The puppet maybe served as a kind of barrier or intermediary between the audience and the artist. And yet, of course, to be a puppeteer requires the body, demands its entire engagement. But Dina Pronicheva never spoke about her life as a puppeteer. We don't know how she returned to work, how she worked with her peers with different wartime experiences, how she experienced the stories her puppets, those brought to life by her work, told post-war audiences. But we do know that Pronicheva went every year with others to Babyn Yar. And she attended the now famous meeting in 1966 on the anniversary at which Ukrainian dissident Ivan Dzyuba spoke. Babyn Yar was clearly central to her life, and she has become a representative of that atrocity. But her own story is actually bigger than the ravine. Reducing her to a survivor and witness, however important, diminishes her agency. Her life is not separate from Ukrainian theater, and Ukrainian theater is deeply intertwined with and shaped by the war and the murder of the many artists who have performed in it. Theater and violence are part, as she shows us, of the embodied experience of war. And finally, I'd like to end with how Dina Pronicheva makes space for Jewish experience in Ukraine, or rather shows that Ukrainian studies does not exist without Jewish studies. Actually, it's very hard to separate them. Dina is of this place. She's a Kiev actress, a Kiev survivor, a Kiev region artist and resistor, and she returns to the same apartment in Kiev in which she lived before the war. Her story is Kiev's, her story is Ukraine's. Babyn Yar is a scar on the city and on her body, and in the narrative of the history of culture in this place. She's often been categorized in Jewish history, Holocaust history more specifically, but she also belongs in place, in this place. Her deep involvement with Ukrainian language theater, including with some of its avant-garde celebrities, shows the inextricable Ukrainian, Jewish, and Polish and Russian cultural patchwork in this place. Her story surfaces the network of Jewish artists who did survive the war and who worked in post-war theater in Soviet Ukraine, and it challenges us to think about the legacies of the war in the post-war, the ways the experience of the war shaped the post-war, and methodologically to consider the epistemology of the body, to consider the ways in which bodies told stories as much as texts, the ways in which the body of post-war theater silenced or was silenced by wartime trauma. Thank you.
Thank you. I take a moment not only to switch PowerPoint, but to just to still let the lecture. I just don't know. I will try to to take space in our imagination. Thank you, Mehil, so much. And in my second part, will be very different. We will move spatially to Lviv, and we will move temporarily to the present century, to 21st century. The question, then Dina was giving a talk, giving testimony on a trial in 46. The city that is at the center of this presentation was just barely more than a year annexed and incorporated into Soviet Ukraine. And this was the city where most of this, more than 1/3 population, Jewish inhabitants, Jewish Lvivians, did not make for the war, for the Holocaust, were killed either in the city or in nearby Belzhytsk. It was also in 46 that the mass deportation of Polish citizens was almost completed, not entirely. So this is the city where I happen to live and work, and a city that survived through the war incredibly undamaged, but also damaged, undestroyed and destroyed, because it was undestroyed in terms of physical environment. Most of the city is like 90%, over 90% calculated by Soviet officials that were survived. and more than 90% of population who were people, inhabitants, who were there before 39 did not, were either killed or displaced. So who were people who lived and worked before the war, and how contemporary in the city, as contemporary inhabitants, do we tell their story, and how it can be our story, and in what way, and with what caution and sensitivity. So as you know, the city has many names: Lvov, Lemberg, Lviv, Lemberg, Lvov, and it's a place. So in my presentation, I will focus on two projects where the Center for Urban History, where I work, was a partner. So it was not an initiative of only one institution. It takes many to do things. So it will be a talk about space, but quite literally, space as physical space. How do you make an intervention into historic fabric of the place to bring the space for the stories of people? So I'll talk about memorial space and the public space, and how Jewish histories and voices are brought, and what they mean, what that can mean, and what are the challenges and issues, and what are the limits. So talk about very, very central part of the city. So we have the market square, and we have Jewish historical quarter, which was there until the late 18th century, which is a thrown stone from the market square, from where the seat of power of the city is. Yet, it was a place where, when thinking about Memorial, which opened in 2016, was, on one hand, was probably one of the very few places so central that physically you could see the destructiveness, that how war was physically the trace of destruction. So 2 synagogues were blown, and Beit HaMidrash was destroyed in 1943, and what was remaining was one wall. And in a city which is almost entirely, if you would know the history, know this place, it looked like buildings are intact. You have to literally not go inside, but actually know the stories of people, but people were not there to tell the story. So looking at this place in 2008 was a place which called for what one can do, and actually what one should do and who should do that. So that was something that while we as an academic and public history institution could raise as an issue, and we're indeed doing a conference, that was the question for the municipality, and the notion, what can you do and how you take an action. And the action, which was slowly growing through almost 8 years, between 2008 and 2016, and was only partially realized, was a very modest and minimalistic monument, because actually you do already have a monument there. The wall of the Golden Rose Synagogue is a monument. So what was added were voices, and the memorial, of which I will, you see the image, and that's already a couple of years, and trees are bigger. The memorial is an intervention which was thought as, and still is, as a temporary, because we do not know how the place will go, if there would be a synagogue can be rebuilt, how something else can come out of that. But the point was to have a place through which one can have an entry, or one of the entries, into the stories, not only of destroyed buildings, but destroyed lives. So a part is thinking through AGO documents and individual voices, and actually looking for the text. So over 2 years, there was a quest and request and emails to historians, to colleagues across different countries, saying, could you check your laptops? Could you check your notes? Could you suggest so that we can check and we can come up with the quotes from people who were Jewish and were living in the city through the history, not only before the Holocaust, not through the Holocaust and after the war. We ended up with almost 100 quotes, and the tough question and the tough challenge of selection was about getting people from different organizations who were partners and people who were part of Jewish communities organization, and going and sitting for a couple of days and discussing which text would go written in stone. And that's something else than written on paper. So something you write. What do you write in stone that has meaning now and could have a meaning later? And these texts were thought as to show a diversity, and a diversity is a diversity of to have men and women, to have people who are adult, but also when possible, not only adults, so there are two children. And what obviously came was multilinguality. So there are different languages in which originally they were written. So there's Hebrew, Yiddish, German, Polish, Russian, French, Dutch, and one. It was really not that easy to find one in Ukrainian, written in Ukrainian, not translated, but that came from the late 80s, 1980s. So putting that in stone and writing them down was also the question, because these are excerpts, these are cuts in this issue of editing and what can go into the text. It was a contentious issue because when you think about killing and destruction, it did happen not only in the midst of the populated city, in the midst of the city where Polish and Ukrainian neighbors were living, it also happened with the individual and organized collaboration. So how do you talk about that? And how you not open a memorial which talks about experiences while actually missing or silencing or not. And the very good example here is a quote from Inka Katz, who lived after the war in Paris. And she tells a story which was very deeply personal. So the choice was either to take rather general words and phrases on the level of philosophy from Martin Buber, or take something which is individual, but also very everydayness and personal. So she talks about how her mother has been taken, and she was looking through the window. She was 12, and in that moment she said, she recalled, I was not a child anymore. I saw my father running after my mother, behind her, on the street. I understood it was over. I knew what was happening. I can still visualize this scene. My mother's dress, her high heels. There are 3 dots because it was something that was not included, that it was German unit and Ukrainian police. And it was, it actually was a unanimous from different people talk in the conversation, should we include that or should we not? And that was the question. I said, probably we will do a dot, 3 dots, and think that we have to figure out how to include the story of Ukrainian police. So what is unspoken? So unwritten became spoken. And at the opening of the memorial came Leszek Allerhand, who saw, and he shows the apartment in which he and his family lived, and the story of his survival. He recorded and recalled. There is a publication, but he saw with his eye how the synagogue was rounded up and destroyed, entered into the interiors and desecrated, and that Ukraine by German units, and the Ukrainian police was taking the perimeter. And knowing that he could speak that, and that he asked him to speak about the opening, was the way of publicly speaking about something that we as researchers know and write, about how to bring that into public. But one thing to say, but another is also to explore and find other ways of exploring. And one of the big and still not entirely researched and reckoned with is the story of Lviv pogrom. And next year, together with artists and involving and inviting researchers who were dealing and who actually worked with anti-Jewish violence and specifically with Lviv pogrom, we did an exhibition. And we went through lectures and talks and conversation. And I really like, how, again, you make this spoken. You actually say it loud, and you say it loud in place, and you say it loud. So in 2021, a part of the area where Great City Synagogue and Golden Rose Synagogue were located, the historic Jewish quarter, again, together with City Council, and we went into designing a signage, a project of signage. And that was the issue, that in this signage, which often is about buildings, you actually have to include the story of what happens to the building. And here is a word about saying that the destruction just didn't happen in 43, that there was the perimeter, those Ukrainian police in 41, and the first time this building was attacked, and there was Ukrainian police, and Ukrainian police was working with German authorities. So the conversation shifted because there was a question, should we do that, or we just say that it was destroyed and do a dot. But you actually, if you're opening the plaque and we are doing that, you actually have to, at least have to try. So the plaque is still there already for 2 years, and it is, so far, is intact. We do not know how many people read it. We know that guides are discussing that, but it's there. So, and very close, like couple meters around it, in the Jewish historical quarter, there was a square. And the square, which had to go through the, renovation. It's a very city center. It's a city which is a touristic. It's a UNESCO heritage site. So you see a lot of renovation happening, restoration. And the question was, how do you do more than another beautification of the area? How you bring the story of the place. And the place is Meir Balaban, and this is the illustration from his work. And Natalia wrote a book about Meir Balaban, and going through the story of Jewish historic quarter and marking and doing the signage, it's like, hey, we do have this, it's the tiniest square in the city. And the square, which was renamed several times from Judenplatz, emerged in the early 19th century into Platz Wexlarski, Wechselplatz, and Kolyivshchina Square. And Kolyivshchina Square is a name for the Cossack uprising of the late 18th century, and a part of anti-Jewish violence, and pogrom was a big part of Kolyivshchina. It was renamed in 1950, and it was connected to a prison, to the Arsenal building, with basically post-war disregard of what happened to the people who were living in this area, or Jewish death and killing and suffering as a part of war story. So Kolyivshchina Square stays, is the name of the street, of the square. So how you have the square, and then how you, through the, making the beautification of the square, not only a beautification, but you think in terms of the stories and the building, stories of people who lived in the square. And in one way, because it's a small square, there are not many people who were famous, because if you think about quotes were from people who left works written, books written, testimony given, poetry written. So we worked with And here, first we followed the story of Meyer Balaban and Deborah Fogel, and particularly how they think about the city as a walking and what they write. So we do have the quote which is already at the space of synagogue, and then the quote of Deborah Fogel, which is there, but it's not this quote. But her text, and she was an art critic and poet who was killed in Lviv in Akция 42 in ghetto, made us thinking that actually we might be looking for people who left records, but what other records about people, where we are going to, where else we actually could go. And what we did that the part of the square had a well. And thinking about well, I was thinking about the place where people meet. So the square is a site of meeting. And looking through the everydayness put us into reaching out to a source that everybody who does genealogy, or actually, it's an address book. So going through something that is at your hand and actually call it through who are, what are the voices? What is what we could include? So we went through all of and looking through the area around. This is how it looks in Polish. Checking Boimów, so it's several streets around. And what you have there, you have an address, you have a name, a surname, as you see here, Bauer, and you have profession. And understanding how many people live there, actually picked up with colleagues and with my colleague at the center, historian Vladislava Moskalets, sitting and going through the list. Decision, let's bring people who live there, just and around the corner. We pulled through the different yearly edition. The language was that it's in Polish. And then let's translate some into Yiddish and translate some into Ukrainian and keep the name and profession, something very individual, but also something very social. And that makes you think both as a people who are, people who have the role and impact in urban life, and not only poets and not only writers and not only thinkers, but also people who do, from whom basically depends on life, who sell, who tailor, who photograph, who own the washing place, and you go through, and it's not only about, so there was a reconstruction of the well, and these names were put around the circle, and it's something that shows, about the neighborhood in the past in some way. The signals that you're not talking about, history as big history, but also history as lived history, as history literally inside of your building and inside of your apartment, and asking, who lived here before, and especially in an undestroyed city. So the place really got quite, liked by people nearby and visiting and following on social media, following the scene. As somebody who came to live in Lviv, I happen to know from Yanakievo many years ago, about 10 years ago. It's near Donetsk city, and I happen to know her really, really far distance. I know that she used to be a tailor. She studied as a tailor, and she came to this place, and actually she made a video to the Kravczynia Lola, Tailor Lola, and she studied tailoring. And you do not know what is the extent of such association and connection, but how there are different ways of bringing and making space, and one can be about culture and history and people who end up but also people with whom the daily life and the city is. So the renaming of the square remains to be an open and unclear. There is an opening of the old as a part of restoration. The square is still named Koliyivshchina. There was an art action of changing it by artists and calling Lemberg Place. So I think that in a way, on one hand, it frustrates and kind of sees how inappropriate and cruel it is to keep a name in this place. But on the other hand, the names on the square, and there are also descriptions who and what was the Jewish district. There is a signage around, and the need for city guides with whom we keep in touch to explain that the history and the tension, the name, perhaps creates a crack or dissonance, and through this dissonance comes uneasiness. So this is the buildings which were marked: mikvah, school, editorial house, on which we included that the last editor of Chwile was killed in the Lviv pogrom. So it's also how do we write, what we do write on the plaque about the building, and then finally, like how this public history project, several projects, how they're bringing Jewish experiences into the city. Makes you think about urban history as something which intersects and connects national history, and here Ukrainian, Polish, Jewish, and how to make them connect. How this connection push you to think the history of Ukraine, because it's not only about adding, because you never can add. The very fact of including requires for you to rethink other. Even if you still can't rename Koliyivshchina Square, it pushes you to think, what is Koliyivshchina? You have to ask this question when you bring Jewish experience and history. And actually, if you bring Jewish heritage into your cities, it actually pushes you. It also, think about, how this placedness of Jewish history in the specific site of contemporary Ukrainian city in Ukraine, how that makes you think. And in very broad sense, how this understanding, helps shape the future of the place in a more sensitive way, and also imagining what society is through the sensitivity of the past to the sensitivity of the present. And thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So we have a little bit of time left for conversation, for questions. And I want to thank Rebecca Jefferson for kindly hosting us in this beautiful space in the Judaica Suite. And the request is for our guests to rephrase the question when it's asked, so that it can be recorded for viewing from the streaming later. So let me open the floor, and I will get started then. So I thought these are two incredible, I thought these were two incredible ways of thinking together about the multiple layers of reading those histories that so often are disconnected and are parts of separate conversations. And I want to start, Michael, with Dina, because I'm guilty. In my own teaching, she appears precisely in that role of the survivor, right? And then someone who gives her testimony in the trial, and it's literally that kind of a footnote, an actress, but also her personal
existence in two worlds by being married to a Ukrainian man. I didn't know, for example, biographically, that she comes out of the war experience with a new relationship, new husband. So one of many questions. I wonder, you talked about the puppet theater. If you could talk a little bit more of puppet theater as a particular form of theater and place of meeting. I think, for me, what you said towards the end of your talk was incredibly powerful, how she goes back to that theater, not to any other of her activities before and during the war, right? But is this before the war, in the Soviet time? Is this some kind of a bigger project of integration of artists from various milieus?
Yes, so there's a red light here, is that normal?
Um,
Okay.
Or we can go back and forth.
You can also go back and forth.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a great question. And never ask a theater historian about puppet theater, right? For a quick answer, there's a long history of children's and puppet theater in the Soviet Union. Part of it is historical. In Eastern Europe, there was a long history of vertap, and there's a Polish word that I'm just blanking on, but 2 levels of puppets performed for nativity plays around the holidays. In any case, there's a long history of puppets in the region, but for the Soviets, it was a way of educating children. So there was children's theater was very much invested in by the state, and of course, a division of children's theater is puppet theater, right? Puppet theater for children. And so all of the Soviet republics had puppet theaters. Actually, Ukraine was the first to have a puppet theater. Well, little known fact. But they were very important in conveying Soviet messages to children. So actually, interestingly, in the 1920s, there was an anti-fairy tale policy. So puppet theater performances were very avant-garde, and they were about like hygiene, fulfilling the 5-year plan, right? Getting children motivated to be good Soviet citizens. Eventually, obviously, those plays were very boring, so they came back to the fairy tales, right? But it was a place of real experimentation, and so you see a lot of artists actually really involved in the puppet theater. We might think of it as, oh, it's theater for kids, but actually that's where a lot of these artists were really working. From a gender standpoint, there's actually something very interesting, too, which is that a lot of women were involved in theater for children and puppet theater and making puppets and like really involved in this sort of aspect. And there's been less work on those aspects of theater than the famous avant-garde theaters throughout the Soviet Union, right? And so we've missed a lot of the story of women in theater precisely because they were working in these theaters for children that might have been doing more just hackneyed propaganda plays or fairy tale plays, but actually were really places that were very important. In terms of sort of what you're talking about, this diversity of kind of milieus and ethnicity, I mean, that was a feature of theater in this region in Soviet Ukraine. And we miss it when we study it, which we have studied it, as separate ethnic theaters. There's the Ukrainian theater, there's the Yiddish theater, there's the one Polish theater, right? And there's Russian language theater. And it's generally studied separately. But actually, when you look at it, you see a ton of overlap. Particularly tech people and designers are working in multiple theaters, directors as well, some actors even. There's less, with the really big Ukrainian language theater, the Berezil, there's kind of less multi-ethnicity there, but there is some, particularly in their orchestra. There's a lot of Jewish musicians. So in fact, to really study theater in a multi-ethnic place requires not using the ethnic lens. And then you actually see a lot of this kind of, a lot of this overlap and exchange. And I think that's something that we've missed and that's really important to highlight and surface.
I will ask a quick question to Sophia and pass the mic. So I think there are many interesting moments of conversation. One that I find very striking is coexistence of life and violence, or violence being part of everyday life experience, and then also presence or absence of that. So I wonder, Sophia, in the projects that you described, do you have a sense it has an additional life now that the city is filled with refugees? Do you have a sense of how they interact with those spaces that bring back the multi-ethnic history, including history of collaboration, difficult history?
Thank you so much. When we were working with the quotes, it was 2000, started 13, 14, kind of finalizing in 15, like adding, and there was already a wave of refugees. It was not as big as now, right? So there was this growing sense that, and Lviv was on the receiving end, and in a way, so it was not, people were not fleeing to cross the border as it was in 2022. Many people came to live in Lviv, and there was an issue of, how citizens, contemporary citizens of Lviv would deal with that, live up to that, because it's not easy. And then we were discussing this, you would say selection, because you have to make choice. There were 21 quotes. So actually this row of quotes end with Janina Heschel's quote, which she wrote already to the preface of her 1946 text she wrote, published in Polish, about with the eye of 12-year-old girl, about her story of survival in Lviv, in Lemberg. And this is a story which is translated. And she came twice to Lviv. It was not easy. It was not the first. She was kind of persuaded to come by her family members. And she wrote that for her, Lviv is a symbol of every refugee who lost a village, a town, and home. And this quote is there. And we actually were placing it with very specific, like, thinking that in 2016 in Lviv, 15 and 16 it was made. So like this seeing that it is in a whole very different way, with like thinking very much who might read it. And there's much more ephemeral, interaction with the Taylor Lola. She was from Makeyevka, and she left, she had to leave her, and she cannot get in from 2014. So this is the story who is a refugee, and it resonated. It's probably not resonated, the refugee, but resonated. But it's very clear, how you can work with that association and connection respectively, and also not in the way that you would build a hierarchy or would you equate. And, I think it's a very careful line to walk of how not to say that, how to bring it in contact, but not to bring it in competition, and and I think that this is also the story the story of people, or choices people make during the war to the people who live right next to them, right? So how do you do harm and violence to people to people with whom you share a space, and how that, ideology and political can be a part of tearing community apart, and also how much work and how much of imagination and thinking it takes to bring, to make people live together after violence, right? So, or after trauma. So I think in this way, we do have like depth of unexplored. I sometimes don't know whether memorial is a good way of doing that. I think it's more rather through education and bringing in, but all ways of dealing that, of raising this issue is, and I think it's rather a hopeful statement that what society in Ukraine is going through, what is happening with the war, can open, some have an opening of the way you think about previous war and occupation, and that how that thinking about that can also be helpful going through that war. So it's like kind of have this communication to better understanding not only the past but also of what is happening right now. So that's, I think.
Thank you. Thank you both for your presentations. And my question is related to the first presentation more. First of all, it's very interesting material, and you know, as narratives, as a stories, it's interesting. I would like to learn more about it, but actually I have a chance because I am reading your book at the moment. Thank you, it's wonderful reading. And you're very brave working with rather complicated theoretical questions. I mean, both networking theory and your question about body experience and trauma. I believe that first question is a bit easy. It's a lot of archival work, but it's possible to prove. With the second part, it's a bit more complicated, as you mentioned, because you know, it's a window to motivation, to psychological dimension. But what I didn't understand, how these two questions corresponded in your research, or networking theory serves as a, you know, system of facts about their links, which help you to prove, I don't know, body experience or something like that? Or it's just two separate questions related to these stories? And how you work with verification? Please tell a bit more about it. I mean, body experience and trauma.
So those are great questions. I mean, simply, yeah, I think there's sort of two different issues, right? I mean, you know, I think in my first book, I was very interested in networks. And in the current book that I'm writing, networks are there, I guess, because I think you can't write about communities without writing about networks, but that's not necessarily a methodology I'm working with in this current project. And in terms of, I think it's an excellent question about, you know, the verification of a really how, I mean, that's the question. How do we as historians grasp experience, right? What do we have to grasp experience? We have some testimonies, right? And so what I've done is I've mined this as much as I possibly can, right? There's an even longer version of this talk, right? But there's so many things we don't know. I have a file on my computer, things I don't know, right? And it's hard in general. It's hard particularly in the context of the Soviet or an authoritarian regime where people didn't talk openly about a lot of things, right? And so there are some things we just never know. And there's some things that never make it into archives. And some stories that never make it into archives. And so then what do you do when you're trying to tell a complicated story? And this is particularly true for people who are not, you know, who are kind of minorities or outsiders in some way, which is often women, right? And so this is a book about women in theater, a lot of who don't show up in archives, right? And certainly these experiences don't show up in archives. And so how do we tell their story? And I'm actually, and maybe this is because I do have tenure and this is my second book, I've been reading a lot of Ivan Jablonka and thinking about history as narrative and thinking about the ways that we can bring the imagination into our telling of history. And my colleague Anna Mueller actually wrote a book that came out last year, something about an ordinary life. You can find it. But she does this thing, also very inspired by Ivan Jablonka, where she looks a lot at context, right? So no, I don't know exactly what this woman precisely said or thought in this moment. I'm never going to know. But I know what the situation was in this place. I know what other people may have said. And, you know, I can sort of use my imagination as someone steeped in this material for a long time to try to sort of enter into that story in a delicate and ethical way that never attempts to voice things that shouldn't be voiced or you know, frame words in a way that the experience should never be framed in that way, right? There are things that I can never know, and I have to respect that. But I think also there's a usefulness in thinking about what is it like to come back to work after trauma. And we don't ever think about some of our historical subjects in that way. We never ask those questions because they don't come up in documents. But why shouldn't we think about that, right? And I think that kind of expanding our ethical imagination in that way is perhaps very important. It's something I'm actually very interested in right now because of the full-scale war. I mean, this is very much inspired by reading all my documents differently after my friends were deciding whether to stay and go, and watching my friends go through trauma. And then I started to think about my historical subjects, right? They must have been having the same thoughts. They must have been having these sort of same issues. And so I think there's a way in which telling the story you want to tell might require a little bit of imagination and perhaps a little bit of risk. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Thank you both for these fascinating talks. This is maybe less a question, but a line of associations I had while you were speaking, provoking, turmoil of literary associations as well as philosophical and theoretical, psychoanalytic trauma. And my question is, or my association is that between the space of Lvov and the Marionette Theater, puppet theater, as you know, probably in his jokes and their relations to the unconscious, Freud, the book in English could be also called Jews and their relation to the unconscious, has a joke about two Jews on a train, and one tells to the other mournfully, "Why do you tell me that you're going to Lvov so that I would think that you're going to Krakow, when in fact you're going to Lvov," right? So there's this disorientation or errancy of destination related to the city, which, as it were, in its changes of the name, behaves itself like a puppet. It's dancing, right? There's this kind of semiotic and geopolitical dance where the city, the names don't touch the ground, right? They never finalize themselves. They're always errant, right? By the way, before I continue, just to say that your talks, both of you reminded me as if you were puppet masters, because you speak with your hands so beautifully. And I was thinking that you were arranging this talk with, with these gestures. And second line of association is that of literature. This is a space, this Ukraine, right? And this East and Central Europe. You mentioned Hamlet, for example. Hamlet, of course, ends with the piles of bodies. But the first body that is pierced and killed is Polonius, right? Poland is heavily involved, and so is Germany. Hamlet is a student in Wittenberg, which is the source of Protestantism. So there's all sorts of geopolitics, and the whole Hamlet takes place on a stage, within the stage. So this is my second line of association, to what extent history repeats some of these traumatic tropes from literature, right? What is the relation between that? Because history, in fact, resembles a lot of literature or theater rather than the other way around, right? It's already written in Hamlet or in Kleist über das Marionettentheater. So this is just so the relationship between Kiev as a kind of this hovering place between earth and another thing, trauma. Both the woman who collapses after and the famous scene in Eichmann in Jerusalem when the witness collapses, they need to be lifted up so they lose gravity, right? Or that the gravity works on them and they have to be lifted by that, but supported by others. That is also interesting because puppets are something between life and death, right? They are mechanical life, right? They show mechanicity of life. They show violence and death within the living, right? Which has to be constantly uplifted. And ultimately, my association was with Chagall, with whom all of these Jewish figures hover between the sky, heaven, and the earth, right? So there is that kind of also relationship between puppet theater and Jews. And I apologize, this is more like my kind of homage in the paper.
Thank you.
Unless you want to comment on the comment. So I have a historical question rather than associations to Sophia in particular, but it's connected to both. I was struck by the choice to identify people, sort of make them real, make them come back to life within their names and professions, and of course there is a connection between Mayhill's life in the theater and her interest in women in the theater, and Dina. But then Dina doesn't come to life in your paper, at least in this version, so much as a private person, right? She's a mother. She has children that are left behind with her Ukrainian in-laws, if I remember correctly. And so I wonder this layer of people's visibility and invisibility and their concreteness through their personal connections and networks, family connections, and their professional identities. And I'm very curious the choice of marking people as, midwife, a tailor, rather than, a mother of two, a grandfather of three, or is it a matter of what was archivally possible to reconstruct?
It was what was possible to reconstruct, and I think it was rather like not an arch, but like the opening, so that you have like very something individual and social, and you can read, as Mihail said, Jablonka's work is good, then you have these gaps, right? So you could, it's also a tricky one because your imagination can lead you, and you really to be very careful when you go into reconstruction so that you don't impose your own, and also this knowledge of context. I think that for the medium of physical public space, it's rather not it's not in this very materiality of medium, but when we work with guides, like also talking, what is biography? So what is enough for biography? What do we know? What is that, if we have a parameter of biography that has to be like the list you fill in when you get to university, you get to job, or write yourself, book about yourself, or then, we will lose so many people, and we just not awareness of what was there. So like kind of living, say that maybe it like seems that it's so little, that we have from sources only name and profession and place, but actually it's probably is not that little. And the question that how when we can thread, and it's more so the understanding, and then it tunes your attention, and then you see on one hand that this is the story of rupture, because these people most of them didn't make to live after the war in this place, in these houses. They were evicted, many went to ghetto, it was not entirely Jewish area that was mixed, but most of people were forced to leave to the ghetto, and then forced to Camp Janowska, and then forced on trains and taken to mostly Belzec. But then, in this huge rupture, Because also then we were putting these names, came a woman, and she said, I live here, and my father lived here. And he was Ukrainian from Buchach, and he was a tailor. And he got his trade, his skills from a Jewish tailor. And he stayed so, and this, if he would not do that, she would not think that her story of her father, who is just a tailor, is worth telling. So it's not a Jewish story, but it's also part of Jewish story because he's in Buchach with somebody. And so you actually can try, is it a narrative of a big narrative, or it's rather like parts and connections and little unfinished, but in some way also telling stories.
So actually in the book, one of the things I'm working with is how to bring in private life, which for a lot of these women is about motherhood. And actually Dina has a lot in this testimony about her life as a mother, which actually, this talk aside, drives a lot of her choices. So her husband is actually Russian, and yes, her kids are with the husband and his mother. In her time in Kiev, she tries to reunite with her son, who's 18 months old at the time. And actually, she's working briefly at a train parts factory, and a Ukrainian woman who is now one of the righteous among the nations at Yad Vashem helps her and hides her. And they arrange that if she ever has to leave, the Ukrainian woman will take care of the son, which she does. And she puts him in a home for safety under a different name, and actually then ends up living with Dina after the war for a while, and she kept a connection with the son, until she died. And then her daughter ended up in the apartment, and the grandmother died, and so she was alone with the dead grandmother. She finally left, and she remembers a woman coming by and saying, your father's been arrested, you need to come with me, and taking her to another home. And no one knows who that is, actually. And there's a very upsetting and moving part of her testimony that she gives in April 1946, where she's trying to find her daughter. She can find her son through this friend, but she can't find her daughter, and she's running around the city, she says, like a mad woman, trying to find her daughter. She has nothing. She has she doesn't have a coat. She sews a coat out of like a weird comforter thing, and she's running around Kiev trying to go to every place to find her daughter, and she finally does, and she says, everyone burst into tears, right? It's this very physical description of like hugging her child. And in fact, when she gives that testimony in April 1946, so it's a couple of years later, really, than when she finds her children. She can't have her children with her. She's not allowed. She's not in the condition to have her kids. So I think that aspect is deeply important, right? And I think that it's interesting that in the testimony, she actually doesn't talk about theater. Like, she doesn't talk about repertory or like my artistic choices I made when playing Natalka Poltovka, right? At all, right? It's this very bleak story of survival and her children, actually. So it's absolutely there.
Thank you so very much. Rebecca, is this a question or is this, which means that we have another minute.
Sorry. So a question as a librarian, thinking about your wonderful, wonderful talks and all the layers, multiple layers and connections, it made me think about that both would be a fantastic digital humanities project, and whether you've ever considered the virtual space for these projects, particularly with the spaces, like a map that you could have all of these voices come out, all these people and places represented in a virtual space.
I will show one more slide because that's actually it's about keeping Natalia for coffee tomorrow. So we will have, so this will be like something that we started working on that in 21 more. There is a collection in Lviv archive of so-called ghetto cards. They're digitized in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And we were like thinking we work in the city center but actually the big story is the story of Lviv ghetto. It's like big story. And we were preparing a lot digitally. So where you see, so this is the 6,000, because there are almost 18,000 cards, which have, name, profession, done by German administrators. So this is a type of source which in itself is a big conversation of how to work with that. You don't have others. You have other sources, but this is a big, and it's like going through digital and how to intertwine digital, because you see this is the size of Lviv ghetto, it's huge. And how to go through the names, how work with different other sources and where to find testimonies, digital help, because you can search through, you can connect. And then it's also something that how to then make it not only a research project, but also a project which kind of can be a digital memorial, and also an open one, because we bits are coming. And then again, this is the question, what is the story of a person? What is the story of experience? How you tell that? What is enough? And that's the question of, how you connect this digital virtual, which can go over to the very physical place where people are right now living, and how find that. So I do, we do hope for future cooperation around that, but I just, that this is something. And we put it on hold in 2022, because it was something that's planned for 2022, and we just thought that this is something that resonates like way too much, so that you have to take a moment, because you need a lot of resources and thinking and attention for that. We are very cautiously reopening that into a several-year initiative and project. We will see where I will take it for tomorrow over coffee as well. So this is.
That's a wonderful idea. I haven't thought about it, but I will. Thank you so much.
So at the beginning of this presentation, this is a question for both of you. We got some insight into your background, your accomplishments, and I would love to hear about your professional journey from the two of you, of how you got involved in this, because to me it seems like it would be very fulfilling work where you are making a difference by building things, publishing things, speaking about important subjects. And I find myself with a lot of passion and wanting to make a difference, and sometimes I don't know where to start. So I'm wondering if you have any insight on that and insight about your journeys, and if you find purpose and fulfillment from this work you do.
In 2 minutes.
I think we can answer this very quickly. I think one of the things that maybe our presentation has suggested, but we can state more concretely, is that we've been friends for almost 20 years. And not just friends, but I mean, I consider Sophia one of my biggest inspirations. And oftentimes when one of us has to write a paper or a book chapter, we'll be like, yeah, let's Skype. So what I really need is, what do you think about this idea? And can you help me? And can you, and I think in terms of my professional journey, it has really intertwined with people in particular, Sophia, with institutions like the Center for Urban History, and with place, with the city of Lviv, with the country of Ukraine. I mean, kind of in unexpected ways, it has unfolded that is where my professional career has developed, and working with the people is the inspiration, right? And is something that makes life meaningful.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that it's very important to find people with whom you can talk and share and who challenge you in a good way. I mean, like in a friendly way. I think that's other thing is really see what resonates with you, because if you really want to get things do take time. So you have to have like not only ambition but also like perseverance, and really like to understand that things will not work exactly the same way. So therefore you need people, and and also figure out what is your place, which might be physical. I mean, I happened to live and then not live and then come back to Lviv, and I know that this, speaking with so many people who are connected, and also learning stories which were very, painful to hear for me. Because I happened to be born in this city, and so many people could not. So what it actually puts your responsibility, or what you can do, you can change that. But there are things you can't change, and there are things you can change. And like figuring out, from things you can't change, you take an inspiration and you move to the things that you can do and make the difference, and figure out what that is, so that this is not only the difference for you, but for a few more people around, and whatever place will be, and whoever will be there.
Thank you so much.